We're 4 episodes into season 3 of The Mandalorian. It's an 8 episode season, so perfect time for a mid-season review. Unfortunately, this one's going to be pretty negative. It wasn't perfect by any means, but the first 2 seasons of this show were solid entertainment. It had a 2 season arc. Mando does a deal with the devil to retrieve and hand over Grogu to agents of the Empire, has an attack of conscience and rescues him. Then we get a central plot arc that involves escaping pursuit, a mystery to uncover Grogu's identity and why the Empire wants him, and finally a quest to reunite Grogu with the Jedi. This decently well-crafted arc culminates in that special moment in which a CGI Luke Skywalker runs through the Dark Trooper droids like they're barely even there, cutting them down with his lightsaber. And then Mando hands Grogu over to Luke, completing his quest. The payoffs of the arc were completed in a satisfying manner for the audience, with a bit of catharsis thrown in for good measure at the end. I feel as though I've missed out on a season's worth of critical information in order to understand what's going on at the start of season 3. And I can only assume that information came in another series, presumably the Book of Boba Fett, which, for some bizarre reason, the writers of this show have just assumed the audience has watched. Because of this missing knowledge, this season for me has been pretty confusing from the get-go, and slowly morphing into disappointment. The creators seem intent on undoing much of the earlier 2 season arc. You have to ask yourself, why is Grogu back with Mando? We barely get any explanation for this at all, and it completely undermines the great payoff with Luke, as well as the culmination of the entire arc at the end of season 2. It also begs the question, what was the point of the events of last season? If you backtrack and gut earlier payoffs with later events in your story, your audience is naturally then going to start to mistrust any big events or big moments that you create. This is only the first of the major story issues. Next up is the complete lack of a plot. After 4 episodes and half a season finished, what exactly is going on here? What's Mando's objective? After the completion of the central plot arc in season 2, we need a new compelling arc with stakes to be established. Mando inherits a mini quest to absolve himself of sin after removing his helm. But that's kind of a small personal quest with little to no stakes, and they string this out for half a season. I don't mind a TV series taking its time normally, but in this case they shot themselves in the foot by undermining the payoffs in season 2. So now I find myself stewing over that creative choice, and without a new compelling story arc to distract me. We also seem to be completely lacking an antagonist to act against the interests of the protagonist, meaning that there's almost no looming threat hanging over their heads to lend urgency to the actions. Instead, the writers are limited to inventing momentary threats for set-piece moments such as big monsters bent on mindless destruction, or the mechanoid creature encountered on the way to the living waters. These moments are enjoyable enough on their own, but they're like a sugar hit that creates a burst of energy but dissipates as quickly as it arrives, with no meaningful impact on the story. What are the stakes for any of the events that have transpired so far? If I were to try and figure out where the story's going from here, I would have absolutely no idea. It would be pure guesswork. Nothing has been set up for the audience to anticipate with excitement. I'll close off this mid-season review with a few nitpicks. One of the things that I loved about the early episodes in season 1 were the empty space the creators left, allowing the images and scenes to speak for themselves and trusting the audience's intelligence to follow along. That's the sign of a confident storyteller. Far from the stoic and silent Mando that we used to enjoy in season 1, in this season 3, it feels like half of each episode involves Mando rambling on to Grogu with a running commentary about everything that's happening on the screen in front of our faces. The exposition dumps have become egregious. They really need to treat their audience with a little bit of respect. We can work out 90% of the stuff that Mando chatters on about without the need for the explanation. The one time when Mando wasn't around, we had Bo-Katan doing the same thing, exposition dumping to Grogu. One of the most disappointing aspects of the lack of a new plot arc is that instead of moving on to something new, and in so doing, expanding the Star Wars universe with new locations and characters, something that's desperately needed, They've instead just gone back and recycled through all the same old locations and characters all over again from seasons 1 and 2. The excuses for revisiting old locations again are extremely thin. Mando needs a droid to test the toxicity of the air on Mandalore, and for some reason decides that he absolutely must have the droid that blew itself up to save them in Season 2. This takes him back to Navarro to see Carl Weathers again, then over to Tatooine to visit the mechanic woman. And this entire sequence ends up being pointless when the droid can't be fixed. Nothing new sense of progress, just swimming around in the same old stanky bathwater. Each episode has a sequence or events that physically threatens the safety of Mando and Grogu. This event isn't attached to or related to the central plot of the episode at all. It just develops from nowhere and finishes with little to no payoff because there was no greater purpose or meaning to it in the context of the story. For example, in episode 1, Mando encounters some pirates on Navarro, gets into a gunfight, and then is attacked by the pirate fleet when he leaves the planet and has to engage in a dogfight around an asteroid belt. In episode 2 on Mandalore, Mando encounters a mechanoid-type creature that attacks and captures him. In episode 4 at the Mandalorian base camp, they're attacked by a massive flying dinosaur and have to rescue one of their foundlings. Now, I don't mind this kind of setup from time to time, but the fact that we seem to get one per episode makes it feel very formulaic, and the lack of relevance of these encounters to any overarching narrative or progress in the main story makes them feel rather pointless. Combined with the lack of plot so far this season, these encounters feel like a misdirection by the showrunners, throwing action scenes at the screen to keep their audience distracted in the hope that they fail to realise that there is no story going on. The interlude segment on Coruscant in episode 3 was in some ways a welcome break from the disappointing central story, or lack of central story so far. During this sequence, I was desperately hoping that a new villain would emerge, or some critical plot element would be introduced to provide focus to the story. But ultimately, it didn't seem to go anywhere, and was rather pointless. So how to wrap this up? Very disappointing so far. The biggest takeaway for me at the mid-season point is the lack of new creative ideas from the showrunners and writers. The plot, if you can call it that, is meandering along without a clear direction or compelling objective. I have to ask myself, what is the Mandalorian's motivation now? What is guiding his actions? Come on now. You have an entire galaxy of systems to explore in this world of Star Wars. An infinite number of possible stories to tell and events to unfold. Looking forward for the remainder of the season, we need to see a compelling objective emerge for Mando and Grogu, and we need to see an interesting villain established. Without these two things, I'm afraid the show will continue to disappoint.